Hey, today we're going to start our discussion of trait theories of personality. So we're moving from the psychodynamic theories, which say a lot about how personality develops and the major motivating forces for human behavior. But they're not really based off of scientific data. They're not really based on any empirical evidence. Trait theories, on the other hand, are going to do a very good job of being based off of evidence, but they're not going to do a very good job of explaining why these traits come into being. All right, so we're going to look at some of these trait theories of personality. Kind of the roadmap, we're going to first talk about some early trait theories in personality, some trait theories before the big 5-factor theory of personality. Then we're going to go and spend a decent amount of time in the 5-factor model of personality, a model of personality that many people accept nowadays, or at least as a good starting point for the study of personality. Has a very important role in the history of personality, and many of the lectures that are going to come after this class are going to be based on these 5 factors, so it's important that we know what they are, know why this theory is so important. And we're going to wrap things up by talking about evidence for the 5-factor model. Why do so many people accept it, or at least accept it as a good starting point for the study of personality? And then criticisms. What are some limitations of the 5-factor model of personality? Okay, the first thing that we want to do is talk about some different ways in which personality psychologists view traits. All right, so personality traits, remember, these are ways in which people differ, all right, ways in which people differ on their habitual patterns of behavior, thoughts, emotions, all right, that are relatively stable over a period of time. So we might look at the following examples of some personality traits: impulsiveness, extroversion, lazy, agreeable, bashful, anxious. All of these might refer to different personality traits, or maybe they might refer to the same personality traits. So we need to be mindful how we name these personality traits, and how do we come up with a number of how many traits truly exist, and not just reinventing the wheel and finding another personality trait that just goes by a different name. Personality psychologists have 2 different conceptions of traits. The first is that traits have internal causal properties. Right? Traits, extroversion, agreeableness, whatever that trait is, it exists somewhere physiologically. It exists somewhere in the brain. There might be a difference in neurotransmitters. There might be a difference in brain structure, but we're referring to a real difference in somebody's brain that leads to changes in how that person behaves, feels, or thinks. All right, so extroversion might be related to more neurotransmitters in the frontal lobe, for instance. And this causes people to seek more outside stimulation, to hang out with more people, to avoid situations when they're going to be alone. All right. So traits as internal causal properties. This is a conception of traits, that traits exist somewhere in the brain. There's some physiological difference, and that traits truly cause behavior to occur. Okay, traits truly cause someone to behave a certain way. Why did Bob go to the dance? Bob is extroverted. The fact that Bob is extroverted caused him to go to the dance. In this conception of traits, discovering traits is very important. All right, how many traits are there? That is an important question. How do we measure these traits? That's very important. And once we find out how many traits there are, we can find out what is correlated with these personality traits, and maybe find the physiological roots of these traits. So for this conception of traits, traits are a very important topic of conversation. They're a very important thing to be researched. All right. We might think about someone that is anxious. So why is that person worrying about something? Well, they are higher in neuroticism. Neuroticism might exist somewhere in the brain. Okay, maybe more level of a certain transmitter at a particular part of the brain. All right, so there's a physiological cause that is manifested by this trait. So when we say someone has high neuroticism, this corresponds to someone's brain being different in some way, and this difference leads the person to behave in a particular way. Now, another conception of traits is that traits are just descriptive terms. They don't refer to anything real. They don't refer to anything physiological. They're just a way to describe how someone behaves. Right? Why does Bob go to the dance? Is it because Bob is extroverted and the fact that he is extroverted leads him to the dance? Or is it the case that, well, Bob has previously been reinforced by going to the dance, right? Someone has previously been reinforced for worrying about a particular outcome, right? So it's due to someone's reinforcement history, due to someone's previous experience with these things. That's the reason why they behave the way that they do. Traits don't exist somewhere in the brain. Traits are just ways to describe differences among people. So we might say that Bob is extroverted, but extroversion really isn't a property of Bob. It's just a way of us describing his previous reinforcement history that leads Bob to do the things that he does. Okay, why does someone worry or experience anxiety with this conception? Well, they maybe have worried about things in the past, and that has led them to do better on a particular task. So this might be the reason why they continue to worry. It might have to do with their previous experience. It might not have to do any difference with the trait existing somewhere in the brain, somewhere in the mind somewhere. Okay, so the difference between these two conceptions. Does the trait cause behavior? And if it does, that's very important to study the trait. Or is the trait just a descriptive term? If that were the case, why bother spending time finding how many traits there are? They're just terms. They're just ways to describe something. It's not really good science. We need to look at the true cause of why people differ and how they behave. Maybe it has to do with the situation that they're in. Maybe it has to do with how they've been reinforced and punished in the past. And in that line of thinking, traits are useless to study. We should not study traits. Okay, trait theorists are going to take the conception of traits as internal causal properties, that they truly cause behavior to occur, so it's important to study traits and how many traits there are. When we get to some social psychologists, when we get to behaviorists, they're going to view traits as just descriptive terms. The study of traits not really as important as some other things, trying to get to the true root of behavior, and traits, according to them, is not that reason. All right, so how do we discover how many traits there are? What kind of research method are we going to use? So we can look at all of the different adjectives describing personality in the English language. We might have things like bashful, shy, reserved, timid, sheepish, reticent. Am I referring to completely different traits here? Or maybe it's the case that we're measuring the same thing. How do we know? How do we know if there's a distinction between when I call someone bashful and when I call someone timid? Those might mean slightly different things. What we're going to do to answer those questions, we're going to use factor analysis. We're going to have people rate themselves or rate somebody else that they know well on a wide variety of different adjectives or on different personality questions. And we're going to factor analyze the results and come up with how many personality traits there are. So we're trying to do this in a scientific way. We're not just saying, well, I think that there are this many differences among people. Kind of like the Myers-Briggs type indicator, right? The Myers-Briggs type indicator, well, there's 4 major ways in which people differ. How did they come up with that? Well, it's based off of Carl Jung's theory. Kind of, they added their own, but it's based off of intuition. It's not based off of data. And that way, it's not the best test. Right? We want to be inspired by the data. Let the data tell us how many traits there are. So that's what we're going to do here with some of these trait theories of personality. So trait theorists believe that uncovering the number of traits and the structure of these traits, this is going to help researchers. Okay, if we know that people differ mainly in 5 different ways, we can come up with assessments of those 5 different traits and see how they predict, for instance, how well someone does their job. Maybe how well they predict physical health, maybe how they predict whether or not someone's likely to suffer from anxiety or depression, see how they correlate with a variety of important outcomes. Okay, but the first thing that we need to know is how many true dimensions of personality are there. So that's what trait theorists are going to become obsessed with. And just to mention a difference here, psychodynamic theories for the most part are answering questions about human nature. Why are all humans the way that they are? What's the major motivating force for all humans? Trait theorists, on the other hand, are not going to focus on human nature as much as they're going to focus on individual differences and group differences. So we have a different level of analysis here with trait theorists. They're going to be much more data-driven than the psychodynamic theorist. All right. So let's go through a variety of different conceptions of trait. I'm going to start off with an individual that I like to call one of the 2 OGs of personality research. This is Gordon Allport. All right. Gordon Allport, one of the founders of the empirical study of personality. Empirical here, I mean research-driven. Unlike Freud, who's talking about personality, but he's really not using data. Gordon Allport is trying to come up with a way to study personality that's more data-driven. Another thing about Gordon Allport is he's one of 2 famous brothers in the history of psychology. Gordon Allport's the more famous one, important for the study of personality. The other one is Floyd Allport, who is very important for the history of social psychology. So don't get those 2 people confused. But we're talking about Gordon Allport for this class. Gordon Allport really helped create interest in the study of personality with his textbook, Personality, A Psychological Interpretation, that he published in 1937. This is one of 2 important textbooks that was published at this period of time that really helped get researchers interested in how to study personality. The other book was by Henry Murray. We'll talk about him in the module on motivation. Allport is the first psychologist to introduce the term trait into psychology. And he organized all of these traits into 3 different levels. He had cardinal traits, central traits, and secondary traits. A cardinal trait is a trait that dominates someone's personality. Not everybody has a cardinal trait, but some people do, and all of their behavior, all of their thinking, all their emotions can be thought of and motivated by this one cardinal trait. So it's a trait that is overarching for a person. We can think of some examples of maybe someone that's extremely greedy and everything that they do is based off of the accumulation of wealth. Maybe greed is that person's cardinal trait. We might think of people that become obsessed with revenge, maybe Hamlet from Shakespeare. Maybe he has the cardinal trait of vengeance, and that motivates him completely and utterly throughout the entirety of the play, really. Okay, cardinal traits are things that only some people have. Central traits are the basic building blocks of personality for everybody. Everybody has these central traits, and they vary in certain degrees. So we can think of things like how anxious a person is. We can think about things like how open to new ideas a person is. Extroversion would be an example of a central trait. Okay, everybody has some degree of extroversion, and they vary. Secondary traits are traits that are only manifested in certain situations. Perhaps you're not a very anxious individual, but all of a sudden I put a snake in front of you and you start to freak out. Okay, that is a good example of a secondary trait. It's anxiety, but only in a particular situation when there's snakes involved. Let me give you some specific examples of some of these, right? So cardinal traits, as I mentioned before, Hamlet, maybe vengeance. We can think of some individuals that are Christ-like, that are always self-sacrificing. Maybe this is an example of a cardinal trait. Maybe someone is motivated by lust, and in every single situation they do things because they want to try to have sex. Essential traits. Interestingly, Gordon Allport include intelligence here. So he thought that intelligence is a essential trait, something that everybody has to a certain degree, and it varies. How honest you are, how shy you are. Most things that we would call personality traits nowadays would be in the central trait conception of Gordon Allport in his hierarchy. Examples of secondary traits. Okay, maybe you're an individual that, again, not very anxious, but all of a sudden, if you were to go on an airplane, you would freak out a lot. So anxiety only in situations when you're up high. I have known some people that are very, very nice individuals that are very agreeable, that they would not hurt a fly, and then all of a sudden we watch football games and they get angry, they get mad, and they start throwing things when their team loses. Another example of a secondary trait. They're only angry in certain situations. All right, I've seen students who are wonderful students that are very nice and never say anything bad and are quite polite, and then all of a sudden class leaves and we're driving home, and I'm driving home as well, and I'm a very, very slow driver, and my students are behind me on occasion, and all of a sudden they're laying on their horn and they're shooting me the middle finger. Of course, they don't know it's me, but why do they do this? Maybe they're only angry in certain instances when a very slow driver is in front of them. Okay, so secondary traits only present in certain periods of time. One very important early model of personality, a trait theory, was that of Hans Eysenck. All right, Hans Eysenck wanted to find out how many personality traits there were, but he was aware that there was this different conception of personality traits, that they were not very useful, they didn't really cause behavior, so he only wanted to select personality traits of importance that he thought had a good physiological origin. He selected traits that were highly heritable, which means that they are passed on from parents to their offspring. And there's a great degree of heritability to these personality traits. And for Hans Eysenck, there were 3 of these. There was extroversion. We've seen that before. Of course, this version of extroversion is a bit different than what Carl Jung was talking about. This has more to do with, are you an individual that's dominant versus submissive? Are you an individual that likes to hang out with people versus doesn't? So in that regard, it has less to do with recharging your psychic battery, like what Carl Jung was talking about. So we have extroversion. We have neuroticism. Again, ooh, this sounds familiar. We've been using this term before. So how much do you worry? How much anxiety and depression does someone experience? Is someone relatively emotionally volatile? Similar to our conceptualization of neuroticism. And the last one that we have not seen before, but psychoticism. These are referring to people that lack empathy. Maybe they're overly cruel. They're not very nice. And these are the major traits according to Hans Eysenck. His theory is sometimes called the PIN theory. PIN here standing for the 3 traits: psychoticism, extroversion, and neuroticism. One cool thing about Hans Eysenck's theory is that it is hierarchical in nature. He goes from specific instances of behavior to these general personality traits. All right, so let me give you one example. Suppose, if you would, that you're the kind of person that routinely gives people high fives. Or you give one person a high five today, okay? That's a specific action. You give one person a high five. But if you're the kind of person that constantly high fives people, this is a habitual act. So these specific high fives add up to a habitual act, that you're the guy that loves to give high fives. All right. And if you're the guy that likes to give high fives, maybe you're the guy that also likes to give out compliments. If you're the guy that gives out compliments, maybe you're also a guy that gives out presents for people's birthdays. And maybe all these habitual acts add up to maybe you're a very giving person. They add up to a narrow trait. Okay. And these narrow traits, maybe if you're a very giving person, maybe if you're a very polite person, maybe if you are an individual that doesn't get angry frequently. All these narrow traits add up to a super trait, according to Hans Eysenck, and there were 3 super traits: psychoticism, extroversion, and neuroticism. Okay, so specific acts congregate, they add up all the way to super traits. So we can go from behavior and see the behaviors add up all the way to these 3 super traits. Here are some of the narrow traits that add up to extroversion, just to give you some kind of idea here of what's going on. So whether or not you're sociable, assertive, active, lively, sensation-seeking, carefree, dominant, surgeon, venturesome. Now notice that assertive and sociable, for instance, are related terms. If you're sociable, you're probably someone that's assertive. If you're assertive, you're probably someone that's sociable, but they don't exactly mean the same thing. We can think of individuals that are assertive that are not sociable. We can think of individuals that are sociable and not assertive. All right, these narrow traits are correlated with one another, and the reason why they're correlated with one another is due to extroversion, this super trait. Neuroticism, we have for the narrow traits anxiety, depression, feelings of guilt, low self-esteem, tense, irrational, shy, moody, emotional. Again, we can think of individuals that are anxious that are not depressed. We can think of individuals that have low self-esteem that aren't necessarily anxious, but all of these things kind of go together and they form neuroticism. All right. Last one, we have psychoticism here. This has to do with how aggressive someone is, maybe how emotionally cold they are. Interestingly, for Hans Eysenck, creativity, he thought, had to do with psychoticism here. So impulsive, egocentric, cold, aggressive, all these are related to one another, but they're not exactly the same thing. But all these narrow traits add up, form together to form psychoticism. So Hans Eysenck wanted to make the point that these traits truly caused behavior to occur. So he wanted to make sure that he was able to uncover some biological underpinnings of these super traits. And he did this in 2 ways. The first way is he conducted studies on behavioral genetics to look at the heritability of these traits. Heritability is the proportion of variation in these traits that's attributable to someone's genetics. And he found that all of these traits have moderate heritability. And so he was correct in this regard. He is correct that these traits do have a genetic underpinning to them. But there's many traits other than just these 3 that have a genetic underpinning. So he's right, but there are other traits that have this as well. And the other thing that he did is he tried to identify where the physiological differences were for these traits. So he called these the identifiable physiological substrates. Where in the brain is there this difference that leads to people behaving differently? Okay, so extroversion is related to a difference in what area of the brain. How is physiology different? For Hans Eysenck, he argues that extroversion has to do with central nervous system arousal. According to Hans Eysenck, someone that is introverted, someone that is low in extroversion, has a higher level of baseline arousal in their brain. Okay, their brain's already firing pretty quickly. Okay, so if they go and they see something that is very stimulating, being around a lot of people, that creates too much stimulation. Their brain's already going, it's already firing pretty quickly. That's overstimulating. And the introvert doesn't want that. So they might retreat, go into a situation where there's not that much around them. Whereas someone that's extroverted, they have less baseline arousal in their central nervous system. Maybe they're going about life a little bit more tired. There's a little bit less brain arousal there. And so they seek out situations that are going to be more arousing for them. So they seek out situations in which there's more activity on the outside so they don't get tired, don't get sleepy. There is some validity to this difference in extroverts and introverts, okay? we'll look at, when we look at the biological approach to personality, that the amount of arousal, central nervous arousal, is related to extroversion. So Hans Eysenck is onto something here. But the other two, not so much. Neuroticism, according to Hans Eysenck, has to do with the changeability of the autonomic nervous system. Okay, like how quickly do you learn that if you touch this pot that's hot, that it hurts, and you will stop that? Okay, someone that's high in neuroticism learns very quickly, ow, I'm never going to touch that again. Whereas someone that is lower in neuroticism might continue to hit that very hot pot. They might not learn as quickly about the dangers of that pain. There isn't a difference in this for individuals that are high and low in neuroticism, but that is Hans Eysenck's theory. Psychoticism, okay, who are individuals that are more likely to be psychotic, more likely to be emotionally cold, more likely to be aggressive. Well, obviously men. So Hans Eysenck thought that maybe this had to do with higher levels of testosterone. So people that had higher levels of testosterone were more likely to have higher levels of psychoticism. This is not necessarily the case. There's other reasons why we have. There is a huge sex differences in aggression, and we'll talk about that, but there's many reasons why that is the case. All right, so Hans Eysenck thought that psychoticism had to do with higher levels of testosterone, as well as low levels of monoamine oxidase. Monoamine oxidase is an enzyme that is found in the synaptic cleft, in the synapses of neurons, that helps break down certain neurotransmitters like serotonin, dopamine. So if you have lower levels of monoamine oxidase, you have more neurotransmitters in the synaptic cleft, and you're going to get a higher signal. Whereas if you have higher levels of monoamine oxidase, there's going to be more destruction of these neurotransmitters in the synaptic cleft. You're going to have less of a signal in the synapses. There isn't any research to really back this up. I think what Hans Eysenck was thinking is, at the time that he was coming up with his theory, the popular antidepressant at the time were monoamine oxidase inhibitors. That prevented the breakdown of these neurotransmitters in the synaptic cleft. So it makes some sense that if psychoticism has to do maybe with depression, maybe individuals that are depressed have the opposite problem of psychoticism. So that's kind of where Hans Eysenck's thinking was, at least here. But again, not really much biological research to support this relationship between individual differences in monoamine oxidase levels and psychoticism. So that's Hans Eysenck, and he had a very influential theory and helped influence the Big Five theory, definitely. In fact, some reasons why we call extroversion, neuroticism is because of Hans Eysenck. But another popular theory at the time was that of Raymond Cattell's. Okay, Raymond Cattell developed a personality theory in which there were 16 personality traits, a decent number of them. Again, there are two important Cattells in the history of psychology. There's James McKeen Cattell and there's Raymond Cattell. We're going to talk about Raymond Cattell, James McKeen Cattell, more important for the history of psychology, more so than everything else. Raymond Cattell, not a very nice man. There's some evidence that he stole some people's ideas and some theories, but he is important for a lot of differential psychology research. Cattell wanted to find the basic units of personality. He was very interested in how biochemists were discovering vitamins at the time. They would go do some kind of analysis and, hey, this is important for the body. Let's call this vitamin A. The next one that we find is vitamin B. Cattell likened discovering personality traits in a similar way. So he wanted to find personality trait A, personality trait B, however many traits there were. And he collects some data and he does some factor analysis. And as we will learn, he does his factor analysis wrong. He makes a mathematical error. Of course, he doesn't know that. And using factor analysis, he finds 16 personality traits. And he names them using letters. So this is personality trait A, this is personality trait B. But then he also gives them more colloquial names as well. Here they are. I don't want you to know these. I don't want you to know these because, well, Cattell's theory, important in the history of personality, but many people don't adopt his theory nowadays. So that's not important. But what I want you to notice here, are we looking at something that's completely different from Hans Eysenck's theory, for instance? Okay. Aggressiveness. Well, that's similar to psychoticism for Hans Eysenck. All right. How about extroversion? Well, we've got social assertiveness. We have introversion, the exact opposite. So that seems to be similar to extroversion. Neuroticism. Well, we have paranoia. We have sensitivity. We have anxiety. So we have some of these same traits that Hans Eysenck is talking about. So they're not completely different theories. In fact, all trait theories are not really that different. They're measuring the same differences in personality. They're just breaking them apart in different ways. So whereas Hans Eysenck has 3 overarching traits, Raymond Cattell has split those 3 traits up into 16 different narrower traits. Although there's some information here that Hans Eysenck isn't really examining. So for instance, intellect, okay, that's not something necessarily that Hans Eysenck is looking at. How about how disorganized and how organized you are? Not something that Hans Eysenck is necessarily looking at. So there's some unique things about Raymond Cattell's model. Raymond Cattell, let me back up. If you want to make money, as a psychologist, and Raymond Cattell did, what you can do is you come up with a theory and support it with data. Boom, here's my 16 personality trait theory. Boom, here's my 3-factor personality theory. You come up with your theory, and then you be the first one to create a standardized test for that theory. If you create a standardized test, any business that wants to use your theory, well, they've got a way to assess those traits. So Raymond Cattell creates what's known as the 16PF. The 16PF is a personality assessment that's standardized that measures these 16 personality traits. Some of you took the open source version of this for that discussion question. You create your own personality test, you charge $30 a pop for it, and all of a sudden you're rolling in the dough. All right, we'll see how this comes into play when we talk about the Big 5 theory of personality as well. One last model that we'll talk about here is the Circumplex model of personality. There's a few different Circumplex models of personality. We're going to talk about that, the one of Jerry Wiggins's, but there's another important Circumplex model of personality by an individual known as Timothy Leary, who was a psychologist. Timothy Leary might ring a bell because he's he's known not just for that. What he's known for was giving LSD to Harvard graduates in the 1960s and 1970s. 1960s or 1970s, I forget. But he gave students LSD and then ended up traveling to Southeast Asia and wrote a lot of psychedelic things. So before he was doing that, when he was actually doing psychology research, he was studying personality. That's neither here nor there. Jerry Wiggins's Circumplex model of personality, we're looking at only interpersonal traits. So interpersonal traits, how do you differ in interacting with other people? All right, Jerry Wiggins has argued that there's 2 major dimensions. There's a dimension of status. So are you behaving in a very dominant way? Are you behaving in a very submissive way? All right, so there's that dimension. And then there is a dimension of love. Okay, how much do you like the person that you're interacting with? Are you very agreeable? Are you very nice? Are you very approachable? Or are you an a-hole? All right, so how do you interact with other people? Now we can put people on this circumplex. All right, maybe you're someone that is a very dominant individual and you are very loving, so you would be over in this quadrant. Maybe you're an individual who's very submissive and not very nice, so maybe you would be over here in this quadrant. And we can put people on this circumplex and measure the physical difference between them and know how different their personalities are by looking at physical distance. Another thing that we could do is we can put words on the circumplex. So we could put words like extroverted. We can put words like calculating and pick their spot, well, not pick their spot, place where they are on this circumplex. And we can know how similar these terms are to one another. We can see, for instance, that extroverted is more similar to dominant than extrovert is to unassuming. We can look at physical distance in this circumplex and tell how different and how similar these words are to one another. And this has some advantages to it. Okay, so we can put all interpersonal traits in this two-dimensional space, look at the physical distance here, and then get some idea of the psychological distance between these items, how similar and how dissimilar they are psychologically. So again, two major dimensions, that of a social status dimension, that of an emotional dimension, that of love. And some advantages of this is we can have some advantages are that we can have an explicit definition of interpersonal behavior. Okay, we can say that someone's behaving this much on the love dimension, this much on the status dimension. We can look at the relationships between people and between traits by looking at their physical distance in the circumplex. The other thing is that if perhaps we're creating a personality test, we can look at which items we are not measuring, not examining, if we look at the circumplex. So perhaps we're asking questions about dominance and how extroverted someone is, but then we're missing this other side of the circumplex. So we can find out which kind of traits we are missing out on if we're creating a new personality assessment. All right, so let's stop there. And in our next lecture, we will begin our discussion on the 5-factor model.